What do these 5 award-winning scientists have in common? They're the best in their fields, and they all left Europe for America. Their journeys are just a drop of the many, many that fall into the bucket we call the brain drain. When renowned minds from all over the world move to the United States for the purpose of continuing their careers and work in intellectual fields. But why is that? I mean, in the case of these scientists, it had to do with the outbreak of World War II, but it's continued ever since then. And not only that, it's gotten even worse and globalized. So how has America been able to continuously attract the most desirable immigrants? If we were to pinpoint the start of this brain drain, starting with the region of Europe, I'd place it around the 1930s, with the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany, causing Jewish scientists and scholars to seek refuge outside of Europe. By the time World War II had begun, scientists across Germany and in nearby Axis or annexed countries had fled their oppressive regimes in hopes of continuing their work in the West. From 1930 to 1941, over 1,150 Jewish scientists fled from Germany to the US, with 7 of them being Nobel Prize winners like Einstein and Niels Bohr. Now, I know that number doesn't seem like a lot, but these were just the Jewish numbers alone. There were a lot more that came over. This immigration had a huge impact in generating greater intellectual activity in the United States because of how actively involved they got in the American science scene. We can trace their influence in 2 ways: the construction of the first atomic bomb, which is, well, obvious, and the indirect effect of their mentorship, which may be a bit harder to see, but was the greatest benefit of them, and is even still being felt to this very day. See, prior to World War II, German physics was far superior to American physics. Top American graduate students in physics usually had to spend some time studying in Germany, like Nobel Prize winner Isidor Rabi studied under Otto Stern and Oppenheimer under Max Born. I mean, the Germans were far ahead of everyone, and because of this, many feared that they would win the race to create the atomic bomb. Obviously though, with the Manhattan Project being a success, we saw who ultimately won this battle, thanks to the help of immigrant scientists like Enrico Fermi, who left Italy due to the racial laws being implemented against his Jewish wife, Hans Bethe, who fled from the Nazis, Edward Teller, who fled from Hungary, and by the way is also the father of the modern hydrogen bomb, and really I can go on with a lot more names. But you get the point. Now, while the successful production of nuclear weapons was a direct effect of the migration of these top European scientists, the mentorship aspect is by far what has made America the most scientifically advanced country on Earth. See, when many of these scientists came to the US, they were given pretty good jobs, especially in education. In fact, the majority of these scientists worked on the East Coast, at universities such as Princeton, NYU, Cornell, Carnegie Institute of Technology, and the University of Pennsylvania. Basically, these top scientists like Einstein were passing down their knowledge to the next generation of America's greatest minds. And it made significant dividends, just as of 1977. And yes, I know that's almost 50 years ago, making it outdated, but there's no more recent data. But just as of 1977, 48 of the 92 laureates who won in the United States had worked with a Nobel laureate as a postdoctoral fellow, a junior collaborator, or a student. Fermi, for example, served as the mentor for 6 laureates, while Niels Bohr mentored 4. Meanwhile, the other 6 Jewish scientists who came over between 1930 and 1941 served as mentors for 6 other Nobelists. And of these 6 was John Bardeen, who served as a mentor for 2 Nobelists himself. So you can see now the chain reaction impact that occurred due to the mentorship from these scientists, which has continued to keep America as powerful as it is today. Of course though, World War II ended, and you'd think that the brain drain would have ended along with it, or at least the intensity of it after the fall of fascism. But that's not what happened at all. Instead, there was a second wave, but this time, instead of it being the scientists fleeing from oppressive regimes, it was the scientists who had lots of power in them. Like I said before, Germany was a country with brilliant scientific minds, even if it was taken over by the Nazi Party. After all, there's a reason German engineering has a long history of being associated with precision, reliability, and innovation. So when Nazi Germany collapsed, suddenly there were thousands of highly regarded scientists, engineers, and technicians that were basically there for the taking. They had 2 choices: either go to trial and spend the rest of their life in prison, or work for the US. This became known as Operation Paperclip. Originally, its official objective was to bring these experts to the United States for 6 months to a year to help America in the war against Japan. But after that ended, the world of geopolitics ended up transitioning into a Cold War between the Soviet Union and the US. So as a result, more and more scientists were being taken from former Nazi Germany to these 2 countries, to aid in their scientific advancement in their quest for winning the space race and overall arms race. Between 1945 and 1959, the US ended up covertly taking in more than 1,600 Germans for government employment, including notable people like Wernher von Braun, who invented the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, the V2. and is also known as the father of space travel, and Kurt H. Debus, who became the first director of the newly created NASA. The Soviets won the beginning of the space race, as we all know, with Sputnik 1, the first Earth-orbiting satellite in history, but the Americans arguably won in the end with landing on the moon, with a huge thanks to the Germans. But after the Cold War ended, the brain drain had a drop-off, with the US not placing as much importance as they did before in the development of arms and new technology. With the rise of Russia in the 2000s and now China starting to compete with America for geopolitical power, this of course has been reversed. But the way they continue to brain drain Europe, and really the entire world, occurs in a different way. Rather than fleeing dictators, many Europeans fled bureaucracy. See, on the surface, comparing the levels of bureaucracy in the US versus Europe is quite interesting, mostly because there is objectively more bureaucracy in the United States. In the EU, 60,000 public administration employees are responsible for 440 million citizens, while the United States has a public workforce of over 2 million employees, responsible for 330 million inhabitants. But I'm talking about something else, more so entrepreneurship and startup culture. See, there is much more red tape, regulations, and taxes when starting up companies in Europe. It's way more expensive and much more of a hassle. Now, these regulations aren't necessarily a bad thing, especially when it comes to stuff like data protection. But it massively curbs how many people can even attempt to start something in Europe, not to mention the speed of innovation. Then there's the problem of funding. These drastic differences in entrepreneurship is reflected in the mentality of European investors. American venture capitalists and investors are much less risk-averse than European ones. In Silicon Valley, chances are you will be able to raise some money for your startup no matter how insane your idea is. And if you take the risk and fail, that's okay, because it's seen as a stepping stone to success. That's the culture in America. Whereas in Europe, it's the opposite. There, it's not about investing in case your company is successful. It's about investing because the company already is. And if you do get funding, the actual amount of it you can raise in America versus Europe is much, much higher, with American VCs sitting on $271 billion worth of capital compared to Europe's $44 billion. What this means is, many young Europeans with ambitions to start a company or do something big overall usually end up going to America. This can happen as early as their university years, because the US's top universities like Stanford, MIT, and Harvard attract these international students to attend first. We've seen it with billionaire brothers John and Patrick Collison, who left Ireland for Harvard and MIT, and then proceeded to drop out and start Stripe in Silicon Valley. But even if a company was started in Europe, many Europeans move their billion-dollar companies stateside anyways due to less taxes and for the above reasons, like these 4 French unicorns fairly recently, for example. As a result, Europe continues to lose their brightest and most innovative talent to the US to this day. And with all these super valuable companies moving to America, it helps contribute to the average American salaries, especially in tech, be way higher than Europe's. Whether we're talking about Germany or Romania, way higher. And then this brings bright European workers who are more ambitious and want to earn more money to America as well. It's a vicious cycle that's been the modern version of Europe's brain drain to America. Now you may be thinking, yeah, America has way higher wages and is better for this ultra-competitive environment. But in terms of cost of living, social progress, and especially work-life balance, Europe outcompetes the world, not to mention their amazing social welfare programs, which must mean something for retaining talent. And yes, this is true. But it's starting to mean less due to Europe's demographic crisis. The population is getting older, and the new generations don't know if the pension program will be able to support them when they're old or if it'd even be around. So they move to the US to be in more control of it. But those European benefits have actually contributed to a reverse brain drain. Look at this graph. In 2013 to 2022, the number of Americans in the Netherlands increased from about 15,500 to 24,000. In Portugal, it tripled to almost 10,000. And in Spain, it rose from about 20,000 to nearly 34,000. In other places such as France, Germany, and the Nordic countries, the number grew moderately or held steady. Meanwhile, Britain thinks the number of resident Americans rose from 137,000 in 2013 to 166,000 in 2021, the latest estimate. Also, Europe has begun to invest a lot more into their entrepreneurship as of recently, with the number of startups being invested in doubling from 2019 to 2022, and their share of global VC funding more than tripled from 2003 to 2023, so they are starting to fight back against it more. Then there's Asia. Ever since the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was passed, which removed discrimination against non-Western European immigrants and favored those with skills the US needed, like in medicine and engineering, many Asians were finally able to immigrate to the country. As for the reasons of immigrating, they vary by country obviously, but all sort of have the same fundamentals. Whether it was escaping oppressive dictators like Mao Zedong or Ferdinand Marcos, the chance to make a lot more money or have a better quality of life, usually a mix of all three of these things, many people left for the United States. And since then, countries like China, India, and the Philippines have been especially affected. As early as the year 1972, 7,143 physician immigrants came to the US, with nearly 5,000 of them from Asia. Europe, which used to account for the bulk of such immigrants, provided a total of only 911 that year. Chinese immigrants have only grown since, doubling from 1980 to 1990, and almost again from 1990 to 2000, now representing the third largest origin group among US immigrants, accounting for 5% of the 45.3 million immigrants. The US is the top destination for Chinese immigrants worldwide, accounting for about 28% of the 8.6 million Chinese living outside of China, according to mid-2020 estimates by the United Nations Population Division. This immigration from China is extremely skilled too. They're the main source of foreign students enrolled in US higher education, and its nationals received the second largest number of employer-sponsored H-1B temporary visas in 2021, behind India, as well as 54% of the 2,900 immigrant investor visas issued that same year too. Then there is of course India, the second largest origin group among US immigrants at 6%, the largest number of employee-sponsored H-1B temporary visas, and a country so affected by this there's even a new term being coined, the Great Indian Brain Drain. If you look at some of the top former and current CEOs recently, you'll see there's quite a lot of Indians. In fact, in tech, they really dominate. We all know how important Silicon Valley is to technological advancement and dominance worldwide, and immigrants make up 69% of their workforce in highly technological occupations, with 26% from India, 14% from China, and other Asian countries such as the Philippines, Vietnam, and Pakistan make up 29%. As of 2020, the total number of international medical graduates in the United States is 209,000, 60% of which are from lower-income countries. And India is the top source country, providing 41,000 physicians to the United States, almost 20% of their foreign doctors. In the health industry, specifically nurses, the Philippines has basically propped up America's medical system. Now, this has been calculated. When the United States took control of the Philippines in 1898 after the Spanish-American War, they established nursing schools there to teach Western medicine in English in order to fulfill their own nursing shortages. And it paid off heavily. Since 1960, 150,000 Filipino nurses have come to work in the United States. And although they now only represent 1% of the total US population, they represent 4% of all registered nurses in the US, with some states like California having 20% of their nurses Filipino. They literally prop up America's medical system, while facing nursing shortages themselves. The story of Latin America is the same, except even more widespread. If you look at, for example, Venezuela, following the election of Hugo Chavez as president and then his successor Nicolas Maduro after him, due to their policies, more than 1.5 million Venezuelans have left the country. If you look at who these 1.5 million Venezuelans actually are though, well, according to a Central University of Venezuela study, they're extremely educated. More than 90% of those who have migrated have a university education, and of them, 40% have master's degrees, while 12% have doctorates and postdoctorates. That university also lost 700 of its 4,000 professors between 2011 and 2015, while the Simon Bolivian University, arguably the most prestigious STEM university in the country, had lost 240 professors between 2009 and 2014. Meanwhile, according to this graph from 2018, while 43% of Argentines in the US have college degrees, only 20% back in Argentina does. Now, none of this is really surprising. As I said before, people move to where there's better economic opportunities, safety, and less corruption. It's just natural. And when you're in a country like Argentina or Venezuela that's all the way in South America as opposed to being very close to the US, like Mexico or Guatemala, then only the rich and educated can afford to make that journey. That being said, in Mexico in 2013, they had 30,000 citizens with a PhD, and 1/3 of them lived in the US. All countries in Latin America have been drained, voluntarily of course. More than 80% of college graduates from Caribbean countries like Suriname, Jamaica, Haiti, Grenada, and Guyana have emigrated, mostly to the United States. Countries in Africa and the Middle East are geographically closer to Europe, So, granted, most of them end up making the journey to Europe instead. But their contributions to making America powerful cannot be understated either. Unfortunately though, there's not many clear stats about this region to America out there. And so with that, obviously the US isn't the only country that reaps the benefits. We see Western Europe reaping the talent of Eastern and Southern Europe more so today. Singapore absorbing neighbors like Malaysia and Indonesia's educated citizens. And as said before, the Middle East and Africa to Western Europe as well. But there's no doubt, historically and currently, that America has been the major winner of brain drains. But that's to be expected of the country with the most opportunity in the world. The question is though, with many countries their top talents come from starting to make a way bigger effort to retain their educated workforce, what's going to come next? Because America needs all the STEM talent it can get, from everywhere. Only time will tell though. Thank you for watching.